Welcome to the Functional Medicine Radio Show with your host, Dr. Carri Drzyzga, known internationally as the Functional Medicine Doc. Dr. Carri is committed to helping patients find the root cause of their health problems and fixing the cause with natural treatments so they can feel normal again. Dr. Carri is the founder of Functional Medicine Ontario and is the author of the hit book, Reclaim Your Energy and Feel Normal Again. Please welcome your host, Dr. Carri Drzyzga.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the Functional Medicine Radio Show, the only internet radio show dedicated to giving you real solutions to improve your health. Not only are they real solutions, but they're natural solutions as well. Because as you know, the one and only true wealth you have is your health. I'm your host, Dr. Carri Drzyzga, the Functional Medicine Doc, and I'm committed to helping you find the root cause of your health problem, fix the cause with natural treatments so you can feel normal again and live your life to the fullest. Just a quick bit of housekeeping before I introduce today's special guest. I'm happy to announce that I'm working on my next book. The title is Reclaim Your Digestive Health and Feel Normal Again, Fixing the Root Cause of Your GI Distress with Natural Treatments. This book should be ready later this year, so keep an eye out for it. Okay, that's it for housekeeping, so let's get started. I'm very excited about today's show because my special guest is Dr. Marc Bubbs. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Now, Dr. Bubbs is a board-certified naturopathic doctor, author, speaker, sports nutrition lead for the Canadian men's national basketball team, and strength coach. He's been working with athletes, active people, and those striving to improve their health for over a decade, and is passionate about diet, exercise, and lifestyle being the most powerful tools for improving your overall health, body composition, and performance. He is the author of the Paleo Project, the 21st Century Guide to Looking Leaner, Getting Stronger, and Living Longer. Dr. Bubbs, thank you so much for being my special guest today on this episode of the Functional Medicine Radio Show.
No problem, Dr. Carri. Thanks a lot for having me.
Now, Dr. Bubbs, I wanted you to help explain to our listeners today, there's a lot of people out there that are struggling with their metabolism, their weight, and of course, multiple other health issues. But can you kind of explain the different diets out there? I think most people are very familiar with a low-carb diet.
Yep.
But there's also the ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting, which I bet a lot of people have probably never heard of, and they should know about these options. So if you can kind of tell us.
For sure. I mean, if we start even, take it back a step, and in terms of, the obesity epidemic that we face, diabetes and obesity are increasing, at a very rapid rate in places like America and China and India, but ironically, they're not increasing at the same rate. So in places like America, which have the greatest obesity rates, they don't have the greatest diabetes rates. So sometimes we get these two things, slightly confused because there's so many commonalities. But effectively, when we're talking about weight gain or obesity, there's a hormone called leptin which controls how hungry we are. Of course, the more our blood sugars rise and the more out of shape, overweight, or in poor health we are, the more insulin we need to put out after every, high-carb breakfast or sandwich for lunch or pasta for dinner. Now, the problem with that is that, the more insulin you start pumping out, again, if you're out of shape or overweight, is that you start to scramble that message from that leptin satiety signal, and now your brain, doesn't really get the message that you're full. So this is one of the things when we're tackling weight gain and obesity is that it's really this leptin hormone, this satiety hormone, that's one of the underlying things that we're trying to address. And of course, you say, well, what's the best way to, help fix leptin levels? Well, supporting healthy insulin response and insulin sensitivity, which is, for your listeners, basically how efficient you are with insulin. So again, if you're, the better shape you're in, the ideal body weight, the better health, you're going to be very efficient with how much insulin you produce. And that's one of the reasons I think we're seeing so much benefit these days with diets that are on the lower carb side, or ketogenic, which is a very low carb diet. Because these are ways of just reducing carbohydrate intake, and that's the macronutrient that really influences insulin output the most.
Okay, so can you explain to our listeners a little bit of the details of a ketogenic diet and what that word even means, ketogenic?
For sure. Well, I mean, a low-carb diet is considered about 100 grams of carbohydrates in a day, and that's just a general definition. I mean, depending on the person, they could just reduce their carbohydrate intake, and that would be relatively low compared to what they normally take in, which may be 300-400 grams in a day. A ketogenic diet is when you get into a very low carbohydrate diet. So you're reducing the carbs down to about 50 grams a day, which isn't a lot. So if people oftentimes aren't so familiar with grams of carbohydrates, but if you think that an apple is about 25 grams or a banana 25 to 30 grams, it doesn't give you a lot of room for any fruit, really, maybe a few berries. A lot of the vegetables tend to be things like leafy greens, and fats become the real predominant macronutrients. So 65-70% or more of the diet can be fat. And of course a good deal of protein as well, but not a very high protein diet. It's more that moderate protein intake. So the biggest take home here is that when you start to reduce the amount of carbohydrates that you eat, your body then has to click into a different mode to start using energy that's on your own body to use as a fuel source. If you take someone who's very lean, even 10% body fat still has over 10,000 calories of energy on their body. Yet most of us, if we're tired or if we want to exercise, we're always looking for a food or a drink or something to put in the body to give us energy, right? Well, if you now think about the person who's overweight or very overweight, they might have 30, 40, 50,000 calories of energy. So this is where shifting over to reducing carbohydrate intake is a great way to enable the body and allow the body to be able to burn more fat for energy.
And so, Dr. Bubbs, how do you know, with the patients you see, how do you know who would work better with a low-carb diet or a ketogenic diet?
I mean, that's a great question. And whenever dealing with clients one-to-one, I mean, one of the things that I'm always trying to do, and I'm sure it's the same for yourself or others in functional or naturopathic medicine, is we're trying to lay down habits. What are the things that we can get people to do on a daily basis so that after 8 or 12 weeks, they don't have to think about the thing their doctor told them to do or their trainer told them to do. They just do it naturally. So in terms of picking the right diet, when you have a client who is, let's say, very overweight to obese, I always try to simplify things and make things very straightforward. So for me, it's simply just carbohydrates. Like, let's reduce carbohydrate totals for that person. And now they don't have to necessarily get to a very low carb diet. Sometimes people get, they start reading about this type of thing and they get really motivated and they want to get down to certain numbers. But I think, just starting with the top of the day in terms of what people eat for breakfast. If they're having a bagel with eggs and some vegetables, then, the bagel is a good dose of carbohydrates. So going to an open-faced sandwich or just removing the bagel full stop is one way. Sometimes you'll have people who have, yogurt for breakfast, but, and they unfortunately pick the strawberry flavored or vanilla flavored yogurt, which has sugars added, and perhaps they add some granola, which can be healthy, but again is a more carbohydrate dense food. And so flipping that to just having a plain yogurt with some nuts and seeds and maybe a few berries to give it some sweetness is another easy, straightforward way to just really increase protein and fat intake in the morning and start to titrate down and reduce those carbs.
So I really like what you say about just keeping it simple, because I think for a lot of people, they've been struggling with weight for so long and they think it's got to be something really complex and really difficult, but really it's going back to the basics and being very simple.
Oh, yeah, 100% agree. I mean, I always tell my clients, the solutions are actually only 10 or 15 degrees off of what they're probably doing. The tricky part for them is they can't see which path to take in those 10 or 15 degrees, but it's great when clients, the patients start to see that they made a small change, but then they got a nice big benefit, in terms of weight loss or better health or what it might be. So for very little investment, they're getting a nice payout there, and that's when you get that positive loop in terms of them being more compliant and more energized and invigorated to make some changes, and whether it's the next meal, lunch, or other areas of their health.
And then I like what you said too about like meal by meal, to just look at key strategies. Just start with breakfast. What can you just change with breakfast and just kind of master one meal at a time or one snack at a time?
Absolutely. I mean, you just start your day, you've had a full night's sleep, hopefully, 7 to 9 hours if you can, and you've got this nice, clear hormonal terrain to work with. So the first foods that go in are definitely going to impact you for the rest of the day. And if you can start simple, change your breakfast for a week or two. Once it feels like it's really easy and a part of your routine, then you can move on to the next meal or snack. And actually, really interestingly, there's a study came out about snacking, because that's a popular one where the average person will think 5 or 6 meals a day, this constant grazing or snacking is a great way to lose weight. But there's a few big caveats in the studies that were done on that type of strategy. The first one is that they're typically done in really lean people, 10, 12, 14% body fat, so very active people. And the snacks tend to be very high protein snacks. So things like chicken, beef, salmon. And I always tell my clients it's tough to find somebody who's working at a desk that's got these things in their desk drawer, the grass-fed steak in the top drawer, and then the wild Alaskan salmon in the next drawer down, and that type of thing. So in the study, they showed that at the same exact caloric intake for the day, the group that divided their food over 6 meals actually gained abdominal adiposity, so they gained weight around their midsection, and they also gained fat in the liver, which is a sign of poor blood sugar control and poor health. Whereas the group that just went to 3 square meals showed none of these signs and showed improvements. So that's another kind of little hack or little small upgrade that people can start to try to do, is just get rid of that snack between breakfast and lunch. And of course, for some people who are very carb dependent, they're going to perhaps crave a little bit, and they're going to want a bit of that sugary treat or carbohydrate. But normally after a few days, it tends to go away. So if you can stick it out for a couple of days, then you typically come through and you have a better able to manage those blood sugars from one meal to the next.
Well, I'm really glad that you helped explain about snacking, because we've been told for years to snack between our meals to help keep the blood sugar steady. And I guess there are certain body types that snacking actually does work for them. Like people who tend to have hypoglycemia, they probably do better with the snacking. But,
for sure.
But it doesn't work for everybody.
Exactly, and that's exactly the key here, is the idea that everything's a tool, and we've got to find the right tools for the right people. Oftentimes we get on these, I'm a 3 meal a day, or I'm a 5 meal a day person, or I'm a intermittent fasting, or you've got to just find the right tool for that person. And for a lot of people who are struggling, who are very overweight to obese, cutting the snacking down will be a big help. But like you said, if you can actually do the high protein snacks throughout the day, maybe they're shakes, maybe they're healthy forms of protein, etc., then that can be a nice way as well.
Okay, so let's kind of switch gears here and talk a little bit about intermittent fasting. Now, the first time I heard about intermittent fasting, I was actually reading a book by Dr. Alex Vasquez. You probably know him. Mm-hmm. And he talked about the benefits of intermittent fasting to help with high blood pressure. And I was like, wow, that is really a unique approach. So can you first explain to our listeners what is intermittent fasting?
Yeah, there's a lot of really great research coming out, not only about the benefits on body composition, so, losing weight, but also all these health benefits that can come from intermittent fasting. And the simplest way of explaining it is really just shrinking the amount of hours in which you eat in a day and expanding the amount of hours in which you don't eat. And if we go back to that idea of the person who, gets up early, maybe 6, 7 o'clock, they have their breakfast, they snack throughout the day, and they might have their last snack in the evening at 10 or 11 p.m. before they go to bed. That's a lot of hours in the day that we're actually eating for versus the hours when we're asleep, which might only be 7 or 8. So in the intermittent fasting, they sort of flip this notion, and there's various ways of doing it. The one I find most practical and straightforward for people is to fast for 16 hours and to have an eating window for 8 hours. Now that can seem a little daunting, to fast for 16 hours, but the neat part is you take into account that hopefully you're asleep for about 8 of those hours.
Right.
So it doesn't become as taxing as you think. I'll give you an example. Somebody who might wake up in the morning, and instead of having that first breakfast, right off the bat, they would just delay their breakfast. If you're a coffee drinker, you might have your coffee, hopefully black or maybe with a bit of cream, or if you're a tea drinker, you have your tea, and then you just delay your breakfast. So to say perhaps 10 a.m. is a good starting point. So your first meal is at 10 a.m., your next meal would be about 4 hours later, so say 2 p.m., and then your dinner would be at 6 p.m. So it's not too different for a lot of people, but after that 6 p.m. is again when you abstain from food, and again just go to some herbal teas or some water to get you through. And all of a sudden, people can start to really see some improvements in energy. some terrific improvements in gut and the microbiome, because as you know, sugars really feed a lot of the bad bacteria in the gut, and that can be one way of just reducing the amount of eating hours in a day. Is a great way to help to reduce the amounts of the bad bacteria in the gut. And so that strategy can work really well for a lot of people and dovetail into their busy schedule quite nicely.
And it seems to me too, when we think about how did we eat back in the good olden days before we had factory farming and all this kind of stuff?
Absolutely.
It was more like this intermittent fasting, I bet.
Yeah, and when you think of that evolutionary aspect of just going back to how we've evolved over all these millions of years, I mean, to be eating all day long is probably not how it would have, when we look at ancestrally, it's not typically what we see. So reducing the amount of hours can really be a great strategy. Now, this is especially if you have people or patients or clients who are really busy morning people. They've got a lot of things to get done, and oftentimes they're just grabbing breakfast because they've heard, it's the most important meal of the day and you can't miss breakfast. And unfortunately, they end up grabbing, the bagel with, cereals or things that are very high carbohydrate, low protein, low fat, and so that sort of doesn't set them up for the day, as well as the breakfast we described before. And so taking away the breakfast in that short term, all of a sudden you free up a lot of time and hours to get things done, and then when people have a bit of a pause in the day in that sort of mid-morning area, now they can actually go and sit down and have a good meal.
Okay, so you talked about the benefits of intermittent fasting being, well, you can lose weight with it, it can help your energy, it can help your gut microbiome, and then we talked a little bit about high blood pressure. Are there any other health benefits to intermittent fasting?
Absolutely. I mean, it's we see a lot of interesting things coming out in human studies as well as the animal studies, but things like lowering of triglycerides, which again, overconsumption of carbohydrate will really drive up the triglycerides along with weight gain. Triglycerides are sort of now the new cholesterol in a sense of, total cholesterol used to be that marker that we used for so many years as a measure of cardiovascular health, but of course now in the literature in the last 5, even going on 10 years now, we see that total cholesterol on its own isn't actually a very good marker for your risk for cardiovascular disease, but triglycerides is much better. We see also reductions in LDL and the small dense LDL. So we've got a couple of different forms of the LDL, quote unquote, bad cholesterol. We've got the big fluffy ones, which are actually quite healthy for you, or not bad for you in effect. And then we've got the small dense LDLs, which are like little golf balls. And studies with the intermittent fasting have shown that we can reduce the small LDL particles, the dense ones, which is, again, protective for heart health. We see things like decreases in oxidative stress, improvements in overall cardiovascular health, and even cancer risks. We're seeing a lot of things around insulin, and again, if we're holding on to too much weight or if we're in poor health, or we pump out more insulin than the body really needs if it was more healthy or lean or fit, and this predisposes to 15 to 20% increased risk of various cancers in some of the newer literature. So all these things can be done with just, again, changing the timing with which you eat, which sounds simple, but it's again can be very, very effective.
Okay, so again, kind of going back, you said basically it's fasting for 16 hours.
Yeah.
And for most people, about 8 of those hours can easily be done with sleeping.
Absolutely.
Your normal sleep schedule. And then kind of shifting, eating breakfast to a little bit later, and then having dinner maybe a little bit earlier depending on your schedule.
Yeah, and that 8-hour window is actually movable as well, so some people could even push it back to 11 a.m. and have dinner at 7 p.m. or even noon and then 8 p.m. Because the evening is definitely where people will find this the most tricky. The morning, especially if you're a coffee drinker, coffee naturally suppresses hunger, so it can be a nice thing to throw in there to get you through to that first meal. The evening is when not even so much hunger, but we're so habituated to just, at the end of a busy day, get on the couch and these sugar cravings crop up, and there's a lot of sort of mindless eating or things that just satiate the brain and that serotonin hit you get from a nice piece of chocolate or a bowl of ice cream. So that tends to be the area where people might struggle in the short term, but it's after about a week or so it tends to subside.
So how do you recommend people get through that struggle?
So that's where...
Just suck it up?
I mean, the first thing, the strategy, especially for practitioners out there, I mean, you always want to make sure your client's eating the breakdown of macronutrients, the type of diet that you want. They have healthy eating habits to begin with. If they're already eating things that are very unhealthy for them, lots of sugars and processed foods and caffeine and alcohol, then you may want to wait on the intermittent fasting until you've cleaned up things like the diet and ensure that they are sleeping well. If they struggle with sleep, that's another sort of relative contraindication to this type of eating. But if you do dive into it, some strategies in the evening that are nice. One of them is to just drink herbal teas. Having that same sort of hand-to-mouth contact that you might do with a snack. So like a relaxing tea, like a rooibos or a chamomile or mint or something like that can be quite nice. Plain old water. I know it's not exciting, but a little bit of water can help as well.
I know. Why don't people get excited about just plain water?
I know, and I mean it's amazing how sort of like the egg. It's not trendy. It's not but it's definitely most of us don't get enough of it. So it's one thing to add, and the last one is actually just get to bed earlier. I mean, most people just simply don't get enough sleep, so it's one way to also sort of expedite and help with that. But definitely for certain types of people, it will really fit their lifestyle quite well. And those are the people who, even in the long term, I've got some clients who've been eating this way for over 2 years, clients who had significant weight to lose, over 60 pounds, and effectively brought their weight down, lost the 50, 60 pounds, and are running really nicely with this type of eating. For others, it's more a strategy that you can use for a certain period of time, maybe 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, to initiate a change. And if the person finds that they do prefer their 3 square meals or their regular eating pattern, then that's when they can kind of shift back to. We don't have to get sort of stuck into this one type of eating for forever type thing.
Okay, so then are there any reasons or any people that would not be good candidates for intermittent fasting?
Yeah, I mean, I think those would be the people if their diet is really poor to begin with. We don't want to make them think. I'm always cognizant of the subconscious messages that I'm giving patients. If they come in for weight loss and I hand them a bunch of bottles of pills, then the subliminal message there is that the solutions in all the supplements or the pills that they've gotten, rather than the diet, the exercise, everything else. So making sure their diet is on point is one. Sleep would be another one. If they really struggle with sleep, then that would be an area I would hold off until that's resolved. Stress is a tricky one. If the stress is very high, then that might be another area to consider, because again, you'd mentioned previously with blood sugar highs and lows, more frequent eating could benefit them. And the last is really in terms of females, the stress levels can be exacerbated a little bit. The female hormonal terrain, obviously more complex than in men. It in the longer term, could start to impact things like progesterone levels and the cycle. But those are more the isolated cases. I would say for the majority, it would still be fine. And if for any athletes out there, I wouldn't use intermittent fasting as something to promote athletic performance. But if you're an athlete who's trying to improve your body composition, then that's one to consider it for. But I've had some athletes come in who are trying to improve their lean muscle mass or their performance, and they've gone to this type of eating, and I wouldn't say that would be the best approach for that.
Okay, so what you said there about intermittent fasting and kind of the troubleshooting, I think that was really great, because there's probably listeners out there right now who have tried intermittent fasting in the past, and they really struggled with it. So as you explain that, even something as simple as if your sleep is not in good order, you're not a good candidate for intermittent fasting. Or if you're under too much stress, you're not a good candidate. So that kind of helps people troubleshoot as well.
Yeah, and sometimes we tend to forget that eating is a little bit, in terms of exercise, we're trying to induce a stress that makes people adapt. So they grow stronger, they grow fitter, they can run further. But if we keep running the same mileage every day, then we don't get fitter. If we keep lifting the same weight every single day for the course of a year, we don't get stronger. So that's where, in terms of even the eating patterns, if we're trying to initiate a change, it's good to have a different approach to what you've been doing. So if you're a constant snacker, then going to 3 square meals, or perhaps vice versa. If you don't eat very frequently, then like you'd mentioned previously, 5 or 6 higher protein meals and lower carbohydrate would be a great way to go. So trying to find that balance to initiate some adaptation is key in the short term to get the benefit. And then in the long term, we're really kind of marrying up what people like to do in terms of their eating and their lifestyle. for some people, 6 meals a day is just too much prep, and with between work and family life or kids and everything else, they're running out of hours in the day. Versus for others, it's totally fine. So just finding that balance and that approach that works for each individual.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Bubbs, we're running a little bit low on time. Is there anything else you think is important for our listeners to know about low-carb diet, ketogenic diet, intermittent fasting, all of that stuff?
Yeah, I think all three are great choices in terms of helping to trigger weight loss, fat loss. For me, at the end of the day, movement is just such a fundamental part of health and well-being. We call it exercise, but really it's movement. I always joke around, I've got a almost 3-year-old, and when I go to the daycare, every single 2- and 3-year-old has a perfect squat. And I keep looking around for the trainers and
yeah, you're right.
everything else, and there's no trainers in there. So how come they move perfectly, yet when we go into a room of 30, 40, 50-year-olds, we may get 20% of people who move correctly. So there's almost no food or even medication that you can do that will provide you with the health benefits of simply just movement. So whether it's walking, whether it's body weight squats, whatever it is, movement and building muscle mass is extremely protective for your overall health, and of course very protective for helping you to lose weight. So get out, get moving, and be a big bonus for energy and vitality.
Perfect. Dr. Bubbs, how can our listeners find out more about you, and where can they get a copy of your book?
Yeah, my new book came out last year. It's called The Paleo Project. We got a nice nomination there, Best of 2015 by Paleo Magazine. My website is drbubbs.com, and you can check out, there's a link there to the book, The Paleo Project, and of course on Twitter as well, at Dr. Bubbs. I like to throw a lot of health tips and keep people up to date on the latest in terms of the research and whatnot.
Perfect. So for our listeners out there, I'll make sure to have those links in our podcast notes so that you can easily find Dr. Bubbs and his book. Dr. Bubbs, thank you so much for being my special guest today. This has been an awesome interview.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Carri.
All right, that wraps up this very special episode of the Functional Medicine Radio Show with Dr. Marc Bubbs. And I want to thank you, our listeners, for tuning in today. And I'd like to invite you back next week for another episode of the Functional Medicine Radio Show. As always, I'm your host, Dr. Carri Drzyzga, the Functional Medicine Doc. Have a great week, everyone.
You've been listening to the Functional Medicine Radio Show with your host, Dr. Carri Drzyzga, known internationally as the Functional Medicine Doc. Dr. Carri is committed to helping patients find the root cause of their health problems and fixing the cause with natural treatments so they can feel normal again. Dr. Carri is the founder of Functional Medicine Ontario and is the author of the hit book, Reclaim Your Energy and Feel Normal Again. Please tell your friends about the Functional Medicine Radio Show, and we'll see you next week with more from Dr. Carri.